Hello, and welcome back. I'm Joyce McConnell, president of Colorado State University. Before I introduce the next panel, I want to give you a quick tour of how an agricultural college in a place once referred to as the Great American Desert became a world leader in addressing global water-related challenges. We're here for water in the West because water, assuring its supply, managing and conserving it, has been essential to the development of the American West ever since the first indigenous people settled along the handful of rivers and streams that crossed an otherwise open and arid prairie. When European settlers arrived in the 1850s and 1860s, subsistence farming was possible along those same rivers, and early efforts to irrigate nearby lands began. Then the territorial legislature mandated the creation of an agricultural college here, and from the beginning, water has been essential to the university's development. In the earliest years, Professor Elwood Mead offered coursework in irrigation. In the early 20th century, Ralph Partial developed the partial flume that would help countries around the world measure irrigation flow. In the 1940s, Maury Albertson helped draft the plan for what became the Peace Corps, which has been involved in hundreds of water projects around the world. The Colorado Water Center at CSU, established in 1965, does interdisciplinary research and education to address water-related challenges here in Colorado and around the world. And the new Hydro building on CSU Spur campus will be a state-of-the-art platform to expand CSU's water education, research, innovation, and policy work, addressing some of today's most complex challenges and opportunities. That kind of purpose-driven research and problem-solving, generating new knowledge, putting it to work on behalf of the people and communities we serve, and fostering positive change is central to the story of Colorado State University. In this keynote, Gary Nell talked about storytelling, about imagery, and about change. Our next panel discussion will feature 3 different perspectives expanding on these ideas. It will be moderated by CSU's Vice President for University Communications, Yolanda Bevill. Yolanda came to CSU this past summer from Prairie View A&M University, bringing tremendous expertise and experience from a career that has spanned both the public and private sectors. I can think of no one better to facilitate this discussion of the common threads in social movements, storytelling, and journalism. I'm sure this conversation will offer ideas and innovations you can infuse into your own work. With that, I'll virtually hand things over to my friend and colleague, Yolanda Bevill, for the panel we are calling Moving Minds: How Social Movements, Campaigns, and Storytelling Shape Public Sentiment. Yolanda?
Thank you, President McConnell. I am so pleased to be here today moderating this wonderful panel on the power of storytelling. And we want to feature 3 different perspectives today. One on social power of movements and social movements, and the other on storytelling. Today, we're going to hear from Sarah Soule. We're going to hear from Gary Hirshberg, and we are going to hear from Justin Warland. All 3 of them are wonderful panelists, and we're excited that they are here today. So thank you for being here with me. So today we're going to start off talking to Sarah. Sarah is the Morgridge Professor of Organizational Behavior at the Stanford Graduate School of Business and the Senior Associate Dean for Academic Affairs. Hi, Sarah, how are you?
I'm
Her
well.
major areas of interest are organizational theory, social movements, and political sociology. She has written 2 books, Contention and Corporate Social Responsibility, and A Primer on Social Movements. Sarah has served on a number of boards, nonprofit organizations, and advises a number of organizations, including internationally. Sarah is going to give us the academic perspective on social movements and what makes them successful. So I'm going to turn this over to Sarah. Sarah, thank you again for being here, and I'm looking forward to hearing your storytelling today.
Thank you, Yolanda. Thank you. And thank you to all of my co-panelists and the organizers of this panel as well. So social scientists have been studying social and political movements for decades. And I think one of the biggest questions in this research tradition is about what factors lead to successful mobilization. So for example, why is it that some social movements are able to convince hundreds and thousands of people to join boycotts and sign petitions, march in the streets, or contribute resources, while other movements fail to really get any traction whatsoever? So that's one of the big research questions. Another research question in the literature is the question of why some people are more likely to join and participate in movements, while others are content to just watch from the sidelines or simply ignore social and political movements. And then the third major research question is about what makes some movements more successful in securing the outcomes that they desire. And this third research tradition is what I'm going to focus on today. And that is really the question of why some movements are able to make the changes that they so desire. So when we think about what factors lead to the success of social movements, I think there are four basic categories that I'll focus on. First, I want to talk about framing the issues. I want to also talk about the overall political environment. I'll talk a little bit about the resources that a social movement has. And then finally, I'll talk about the role of the media. And so let me begin by talking first about this question about framing and why it's so critically important to social movements and the success of social movements. So a social movement frame can galvanize and mobilize people by pointing out that what the cause of a problem is. They can suggest solutions and mostly provide a call to mobilization or a call to action. So simply put, or the way I like to think about this, is that social movement frames answer three fundamental questions. And these questions are important to potential activists as well as to the targets of activism. The first is what? So what's the issue? The second is so what, which is why does this matter? And then finally, now what? What do you want me to do to help facilitate this movement? And so we know from decades and decades of research on social movement frames that they need to generate emotional appeal. So, for example, a recent study by one of my PhD students here at Stanford is finding that petitions get more signatures when they express anger or frustration as an emotion. And this is presumably because these evoke the emotions in the would-be signatories. So that's one of the ways in which emotion might be used. And I guess frames often do or are able to galvanize emotions because of the power of story, which of course is part of what we're talking about today. And so we know that the human brain is hardwired to remember story. And when a social movement frame tells a story and evokes emotion, it's likely to resonate with policymakers and be more successful. So we also know that the political environment is very important to social movement success. This is the second set of factors I wanted to touch on a little bit today. So what I mean by the political context or environment it falls into several different dimensions. And so what we need to think about as we think about social movements and their success is who's in power at any given time in the political environment. So for example, some governmental leaders are more likely to support a law and order approach to protesters, while others have been more supportive of protesters and have facilitated the protesters' right to free speech, for example. So one dimension of the political environment might be the willingness or the relative willingness of political authorities to repress or suppress protesters. Another dimension is what we refer to as the presence of elite allies. And elite allies are those who are in positions of power but are sympathetic or aligned with the issues being raised by a social movement. So for example, we know from research that examines the scorecards that are put out by organizations like the League of Conservation Voters may give activists and others a sense of where there are individuals who might be more or less sympathetic to the environmental movement, for example, and maybe more or less willing to collaborate on legislation. So in addition to frames in the political environment, scholars of social movements also recognize the importance of resources to social movements. And that feels almost obvious. And but I think the research points to a number of different types of resources. So of course, the most obvious has to do with financial resources or economic capital to make sure that the movement can get off the ground in terms of needing resources to mobilize people, to pay for fees for permits, for signs and audio equipment and renting office space and the like. But in addition to those sort of obvious financial resources, social movements also need human capital, such as the kinds of skills that we as human beings may possess that can be useful for social movements. So for example, communication specialists, crowd organizers, social media managers, and these kinds of skills that can be really important and critical for social movements. And then finally, when we think about the kinds of resources that movements need, we can also think about the social capital, which are the networks that can help to mobilize people to join a campaign. So finally, the fourth category of explanation beyond frames, political environment, and these different types of resources relates to the role of the media. And so simply put, movements rely on media attention to broadcast their issues, to amplify their stories, and help change the opinion of the general public. Movements that are able to succeed in garnering the attention of the media are more likely to succeed. And we know this from a lot of research on various social movements. So I know Justin's going to say a lot more about the role of the media, but I will just conclude by marveling at the power of the media to help social movements frame their issues and amplify their message with emotional resonance. And so with that, I will conclude my initial remarks.
Thank you so much, Sarah. That's very interesting. And we'll be asking more questions about framing and those kinds of things. So I look forward to hearing more. Today, we are going to talk to Gary Hirshberg about his own experiences in creating change within the food industry, specifically and including legislative change. So Gary is the CEO of Hirshberg Entrepreneurship Institutes and co-founder and chief organic optimist of Stonyfield Farm, the world's leading organic yogurt producer. Gary is the author of Stirring It Up, How to Make Money and Save the World. So we definitely want to hear more about that, and frequently speaks on topics including sustainability, organic agriculture, and green business. Gary serves on several corporate and nonprofit boards, primarily organizations in the food system area. So Gary, we definitely want to hear what you have to say today. I definitely want to hear more about how I can make money and save the world. That is going to be a wonderful story for you to tell. Thank you for being here with us today, Gary.
No, my pleasure, Yolanda. Thanks to you and all the organizers. And obviously it's nice to be with Sarah and Justin. I've been active in environmental and climate and agriculture work and related policy advocacy for now over 40 years. And it's, for me, very, very frustrating to see how polarizing these debates can be. Daniel Patrick Moynihan had that quote that was used through the debates, which is, everyone's entitled to their own opinions, but not to their own facts. But we're now having real debates about facts. And obviously water issues in the West are, an area of enormous passion and very difficult to get people even to drop the pitchforks and have a dialogue. So I'm a really big believer in storytelling as the best way to build bridges for my 40 years. There's something about the authentic human experience that calms the waters, no pun intended, creates more listening and empathy. Storytelling keeps it real. And, it reminds me of a brilliant friend of mine who was incredibly talented. He literally could do anything he puts his mind to. And he chose to be a carpenter. And when asked why carpentry, he says, well, I like to be a carpenter because you can't bullshit a nail. It doesn't talk back at you and it's really straightforward. And because I've spent my adult life first running nonprofits, then building a national brand, then chairing several campaigns aimed at building broad constituencies to change policy, I've spent, again, many decades in the business of trying to build bridges across divides and persuade people to make changes. And time and again, as I said, I find storytelling is really the most powerful way to close gaps in experience and understanding and enthusiasm. So I want to give some examples to illustrate all of this, which may be applicable in various of your the audience's your activism efforts. Probably the best example comes from my business, in that we launched an organic yogurt company in 1983 at a time when nobody was eating yogurt and absolutely nobody knew what organic meant. I like to say we had a wonderful business back then, we just had no supply and no demand. And to make matters worse, because our mission was really based on properly supporting and paying family farmers, our yogurts cost about twice what the conventional offerings were. And that meant that, you know, we had to not only, we only had seconds to persuade people, but then we had to get them to overcome this enormous price gap. And of course, because our cost of goods were so much higher, we could actually afford zero advertising. So our special challenge was we had to get people's attention in seconds. And what I'm going to do is I'll just share my screen here. So this is just a classic example. Again, we had no money. Retailers were saying, well, I might try putting your product on the shelf. How are you going to convince people to try it? So we came up, we didn't have money, but we had cows. So we came up with this very simple idea of, if you sent in 5 yogurt lids, you would get to adopt one of our cows, and you would get a certificate naming you the co-owner of a cow. You would get a photograph of your cow, and then twice a year, in those days, the cows would actually send you letters, which of course were telling stories about what was actually going on the farm, closing the gap, building compassion, building empathy, building understanding. And we had tens and now hundreds of thousands of people who did this. Of course, nowadays the cows are blogging and this sort of thing. We don't even send it by paper. But again, it proved to be right away a very, just by exposing those farms and the actual actions of putting organic products out there, it actually built these bridges quite quickly. And we used newsletters, all the moves that's fit to print. We engaged in another program called FarmCam, where again, with the power of technology, you gave our farmers the ability to tell their story. Literally, farmers would walk around the farm with a little handheld camera that we gave them, and they would show what was going on out there. And this was far better than us trying to explain it, because people could actually see it themselves. And then we created something called YouTube, which you see here, which is our version of YouTube. And here, these were, as you see, lots of stories about how our blueberries are grown and how bananas are grown and so forth. And it gave us the ability to go deep. For example, this farmer here, George Tagg, one of our Organic Valley suppliers, he actually told his story on video about when he was conventionally farming before he converted to organic. One day his spray rig broke, and he actually had to put his hand on the back of the pipe and have herbicides leaching into his skin for about an hour until his son was able to go and get a replacement part and fix it. He wound up getting extremely sick. It took many, many weeks and ultimately years. And this is what really led them to convert. Well, that's, as you can imagine and appreciate, for another farmer, that's a meaningful story. For our consumers, it really illustrated very clearly and viscerally the impact of those pesticides. You know, so you're getting the general theme here. These are examples, and I promise you give dozens and dozens of them. You know, we had stories of our farmers, how when they were conventional, at the end of the day, their kids would want to, you know, give them a hug when the kids came home from school, and the farmer would have to say, hold on, and go to a shed, take the coveralls off, and, you know, the pesticide covered clothing, and then he could hug his kids. And of course, again, that sort of visceral experience of that you could really visualize. And again, video makes it so much, and technology makes it so much easier. And this is relevant, this anecdote is relevant to my water friends here. Another farmer that we featured was at a University of New Hampshire land grant organic research farm where they put test wells in the ground to look at nitrogen runoff on the organic farm into a nearby stream versus a conventional farm next door, and found using these test wells that there was zero runoff on the organic farm. There was so much life in the soil of the organic soils that it was literally absorbing and taking up the nitrites and nitrates. And so again, having the researcher, the people on the ground telling the story, saved us thousands of words and gave that kind of visceral experience. And another featured, one of our organic dairies who, organic sugar suppliers who, I'll show you here, who converted thousands and thousands of acres from conventional to organic sugar in Brazil, and discovered all the many benefits and would explain the benefits, which you see here, using sustainable practices. They would, integrating biological pest controls and so forth, they were able to literally reconfigure their fields to reduce erosion and get huge benefits, over 300 species returning to these fields, water table being cleaned up and improved. And so again, I could talk till I'm blue in the face, but having the actual producers tell the story, bringing people to the farm in situ, if you will, was how we built our brand. And we found time and time again, as we built hundreds and hundreds of thousands, adopting cows and seeing these stories, that this was really what got them going into the stores and asking for us. And ultimately, it got us, when we got into policy, it got them sending sending our stories on to legislators, senators, and so forth. Now, this, of course, helped to build not just our company, but a whole sector. And, the good news is that organic now is available, in 100% of supermarkets across the country. We're finally building data that shows that organic sequesters more carbon than conventional farms, dramatically reduces nutrient runoff, as I said, improves animal health and farmer and farm worker health. But the problem is that we're still only about 6% of total US food and about 1.8% of total US cropland. And that's mainly due to the higher price. And really the only way to reduce that higher price premium is with more scale. We need to get to north of 10% share. And once again, when you're competing in my space, whether it's in yogurt or cereals or grains, vegetables, livestock, fruits, whatever, the problem we face is that we don't have enough margins to really fund advertising. So storytelling is essential. And today we have a new technology available that social technology that I highly recommend to this audience, which is using bloggers and influencers. Probably our most powerful thing that we do, we just did it 2 Fridays ago, is we'll bring 10, 20, 30 bloggers, in this case we did it virtually because of COVID, onto our farmers and let them tell the stories with their little handheld cameras. They'll meet the farmers. And we have women bloggers who will have 18 to 20 million followers. And again, storytelling is the whole story. We step back, we let the bloggers tell their story, we let the farmers talk through them. This leads to my final anecdote that I'll share. As we try to build this culture for organic, not just in terms of consumers, but also in terms of policy and increased research funding at USDA and many other policy matters on Capitol Hill and the state legislatures. The problem is that we, and I know a lot of you will relate to this, we organic proselytizers are really passionate about so many benefits, right? I've already mentioned a bunch: carbon sequestration, animal health, farmer income, water quality, water availability, and of course, reducing pesticides. And the problem is that we talk about all these things and we just overwhelm the consumer. It's a kind of an avalanche problem. Also, we create a lot of confusion, which, by the way, is, when you talk to consumers, the #1 impediment to growing the organic sector is confusion. On top of that, we really don't want to criticize or vilify non-organic producers, many of whom will be eventually our supply chain. But either way, we're trying to support agriculture in general. And so, we also don't want to make claims that we can't support. So for example, with glyphosate and other herbicides are so widely used, we can't say we're chemical free anymore because spray drift happens. And so we just want people to get a visceral understanding of the advantages of organic and what this seal here really means. And so 6 years ago, I pulled together a consortium of the leading organic brands for a 2-day retreat, and we pooled all of our consumer insights to get that one insight that we knew would enable us to hit all of these objectives, not vilifying conventional, making it simple, attacking confusion. And we created a one-page, and we found that one insight was simply this, that that USDA seal, the organic seal, explicitly prohibits farmers and processors from using over 700 chemicals. And so we created a one-page story, if you will, as you're looking at it here, a one-page list of all these chemicals and came up with our Skip the Chemicals campaign. You obviously didn't have to read this list, you just had to see the list to see it printed with the headline that you see here. And you know, it was very visceral, as I say. And it was so successful for us that we then created a video version where we had this young couple actually sing all 700 chemicals in a 30-minute advertisement. I'll say it again, 30-minute advertisement. People thought we were crazy. And it was so successful, this world's most skippable ad. It got out to we got over 35 million impressions. Our target audience of 8 million women saw it about 7 times, and the average time watching it was 4.5 minutes. And our web traffic increased 350%. And they were washing dishes, by the way, as they were singing the chemicals, and you eventually saw the pile of dishes piling up. And you can see all of this at onlyorganic.org if you'd like. So in short, and to conclude, as with the Western water crisis, we have so many arguments to sell, so many critical facts to share, but by picking the one that had the most impact and importance and disciplining ourselves to stick with it, we got our story down to something truly visceral that, again, people would, it didn't take more than 10 seconds for people to actually get it. And I want to end with this point. Equally important to all of this effective communicating was we had fun. We didn't take ourselves so seriously. And in a world where people and policymakers feel like hiding under a log every time an environmental issue gets discussed, right? By keeping it upbeat, by keeping it positive, by keeping it funny, that too goes a long way. So I'll leave it at that and come back to you in the questions. Thanks.
Thank you, Gary. I truly appreciated that because I have a millennial daughter who does not go to the grocery store without looking for that organic stamp. And that's something that I would say 10 years ago was just unheard of, just pick whatever groceries that you had. So I know that you have made an impact with the things that you've been doing there. So I thank you for that. And thank you for showing me how to make money too, so I can pay for the more expensive organic brands that are so good for us and helping to contribute to save the world. So thank you for that. So now I want to introduce Justin Warland. Justin reports on climate and energy for Time. Justin is going to give us some perspective on how media covers change and how the press also might play a part in changing public sentiment. Justin is a correspondent, of course, what I said, for Time. He's covered climate, energy, and related topics for more than 6 years. He's a graduate of Harvard University, and Justin is based in Washington, D.C. So Justin, very anxious to hear from you today on how the media can help all of us change perceptions and change the sentiment and what we can do to influence the media.
Yeah, well, thank you for having me. I'm thrilled to be here and really thrilled to be on this distinguished panel. I'm going to center my remarks on sort of 2 areas which I hope will be of value and of interest to you. First, just to talk a little bit about how I select stories and how other journalists consider what we should be covering. And then the role, just some reflections on the role that journalism can play in affecting social change. So the question of how we choose stories is a question I get all the time, particularly at events like this. And it's a really challenging question, right? I mean, it's challenging for me, it's challenging for editors who have been doing this. for decades. And of course, it's challenging for people who might be experts in their field, but aren't necessarily skilled media communicators. And there are two questions that I would say I think about when I'm considering whether a story is worth covering. One is, what can our readers learn from the story? And the second is, how does this advance the sort of bigger conversation, the conversation outside of the stable set of readers who are typically reading my work? How does this move the conversation along? So to start with that question, I would say journalists want to say something that's new. It's called news for a reason. They want to say something, they want to write something that hasn't been written before. And this can take lots of different forms. Journalists look for scoops, newsy pieces of information that haven't been reported. They do big investigations that can, unveil things that have been previously hidden. There's also an emphasis, something that I think a lot about is, what I would call an intellectual scoop. It's a reframing of something, or writing about facts that are already known and framing them in a different way, telling that story a little differently. And all of these are with the intent of advancing the sort of bigger conversation around a topic. But then there's also room for stories that fit the second bucket, that answer the question, what can our readers learn? And so these are, this will vary from organization or outlet to outlet, but I work for Time, a national news outlet that reaches a national audience that might not be familiar with the latest that's happening in the weeds of climate or water issues or whatever issues they might be. And so in these cases, when I'm looking to inform my readers about something that is new to them. And so a lot of the emphasis here is thinking, is there a way to emphasize storytelling, to tell this story in a completely different way, with either a set of characters or a particular location that can really make the story compelling to an audience that otherwise wouldn't pay attention to a story that's about deep research or other topics. Yeah, and so there are two sort of ways I think about this. I mean, one is, well, I guess I would say broadly, I'm always thinking about, how do I reach readers at their dinner table? That's the way I like to frame it. And there are two ways. One is localizing a story, right? So taking a story that might be about a really broad, global or national topic, and then saying, what does it mean in a local community? So a simple way to think about this would be to go to a community that's affected by fracking happening in their backyard, or a community that has to relocate due to sea level rise. And this is something that is done, I do it, this is a strategy that journalists do at local outlets, at big media market outlets, and at national outlets. It's something that's pretty universal. The other thing I would say as a national reporter is I try to get to that dinner table by talking about connecting with the big national conversations. So, an example of that would be, I wrote a story about schools reopening in Bangladesh after climate-related disasters, by talking about how similar that is to the experience of reopening schools in the midst of a pandemic, right? So finding a way to connect to what people are talking about, because nobody, frankly, is going to really be that interested in today's environment about what's happening with reopening schools in Bangladesh. But you challenge the reader to think about, what is that? How does that connect to my life? How does that connect to the things that I'm talking about? So then, the second part of my remarks, I'll just, what's the impact of this? What does it matter? How does this help bring about change? There's sort of an obvious impact if you're writing about, if you have a scoop where you reveal that a politician has, engaged in some sort of corruption, then hopefully the politician will resign. Or if you do an investigation, hopefully some of the malfeasance will be addressed. So there's sort of obvious in that bucket. But the thing that I have to remind myself, and I think a lot of journalists would do well to remind themselves of, is that there's really a sort of long-term arc of learning and understanding an issue and building a narrative. And a lot of the work that I do writing about climate change is just sort of building little pieces of little building blocks to a bigger arc of a narrative that over time will perhaps lead to some form of social change. And I think you see this in the, in the social science research and in the data about how people understand climate change, right? Like climate change is not something that somebody opens up the newspaper and understands after reading one story. It's something that they learned a little bit about in 1995, and then they learned a little more each year since. And then we're now at a moment where there's this deep understanding and deep political motivation. And so as a journalist, I remind myself, not every story is going to change the world, but you're building those blocks. And I think it's also important for people who engage with media to understand that, when sometimes people might think they might have written a report that is game-changing within the field, or have discovered something that's game-changing, in their particular locality, and expect the media coverage to be as dramatic as the revelation is within the field. But it's important to remember that, in fact, that might just be a little piece of this bigger narrative, and that's an important thing to remember when engaging with journalists, and really sort of setting expectations of what you might want to get out of an engagement with a journalist. I hope that's interesting and helpful. I'll conclude my remarks there. I'm looking forward to the questions.
Thank you, Justin. I appreciate that. I like the idea of having kind of a building block narrative, that you're planting seeds. Since we're talking about sustainability and agriculture and all of those things, you're planting these seeds, and then all of a sudden you have something blossom because the narrative was sustained over a course of time. So I appreciate that. And it leads me to one of the questions, because I was thinking about what Gary said about social media and social media influencing, and what you just said, Justin, about building blocks and narratives. And we know that social media is ongoing, and there are little trinkets of information, but they get a lot of eyes on them, whether good or bad or indifferent. So I'm wondering how social media has really been used to influence and provide insight and input into modern social media, social campaigns, social movements, and how we can best use social media to create change, particularly when we're talking about water, but just in general for movements. How can we use social media? Is it just about influencers, or is it about sustaining some type of presence on social media to get so many people to understand what's happening in the world?
Well, I'll just quickly say, I'm not sure who you're addressing to, Yolanda, so I'll just start. It's an art form now. I mean, to underscore, it's essential, particularly during COVID, I might add, where we can't even be with each other. But the art of using social media is highly refined. Unfortunately, everybody has, screens in our lives all day long, right? And we're overwhelmed and oversaturated. And so how you cut through is critical. And I would say there's probably time doesn't allow in this panel to get into some of those do's and don'ts. But I would say on the theme of what we're talking about today, more visceral, visual, less self-serious, storytelling is really important. Using humor is really important. People are just overwhelmed. On climate, which, like Justin, has been my, focus forever. I literally got my degree in climate change, 45 years ago. It's a heavy topic. It's hard for people to take it in. Water in the West, and the possibility that we have communities, the battle between urban and rural, and we're vilifying, cities are vilifying farmers, and farmers are vilifying cities, and there may be whole different ways that we need to develop. That touches a lot of emotional chords. And I think it's important in the media to not come across as know-it-all, having all the answers, being less of a, frontal assault brings a frontal defense, right? So being less confrontative. And again, I think also employing storytelling, having the folks, actors in the game out there who are talking anecdotally, viscerally, what's going on in their lives? Why is this meaningful to them as people? You right away responded to me by talking about your millennial daughter. that's the way to reach people. We all have, we may be on different sides of the partisan divide or the issues, but I always say, met the consumer who, regardless of their opinions about organic, wants more pesticides in their food, right? People want a healthy environment for their children. They want to get old and see their grandchildren. And so speaking in those emotional and personal terms is a critical way to use media. If you use it like a cudgel, it's not going to work.
So Gary, to that end, I'll stay with you for a minute, but because water is one of these things that people do know about, where it's not dense. Climate change is very difficult to understand. It's dense. You have to keep building on that narrative, but water is everywhere. And people think that they know and understand water. So I'm posing this to you, Gary, but Justin and Sarah, please feel free to jump in. How do you get people to have a visceral response to water? Something that, you turn on a spigot, as my grandmother used to call it, and water pours out. So it's really something that is a known commodity. There's nothing that people may think that they don't understand or don't know about water. How do you?
Except in as many folks in the audience know, that isn't the case. We here in the Northeast have had a drought year. Wells have dried up. Farmers literally haven't had enough water. And in various parts of the country, the same thing is happening, or the water is being polluted, or it's saltier, or it's more expensive. And how many communities in the West have now had water usage warnings, and even on urban systems moratoria? So I think, again, for me, be experiential. Don't rattle off all the facts, because again, we're all overwhelmed, especially in an election year, right? But it's more, what's your personal experience? And again, particularly on water, I think, and because I'm in the agriculture side, not vilifying the other side is really important. Being compassionate, being empathetic, showing the challenges for both sides so that we can have a pooled discussion. Because if your ultimate objective is to influence policy, then you've got to make it easier for these policymakers. If they're just going to hear screaming from this side and screaming from that side, it's going to lead to paralysis. And Sarah was sort of talking about this in her overview. So figuring out, having the end game, maybe bring someone from the other side together to say, gee, is this an area where we can compromise? Is this an area where we can, we see what the problem is, but instead of just talking about the problem, as humans, can we agree on some solutions? That, I think, again, the frontal assault brings frontal defense really summarizes it.
Sarah, I see you nodding your head. Do you have anything to add to that? How do we get people to care and have a visceral reaction to stories about water?
Yes, I think that's such a great question. And from the social movements literature, absolutely, I want to sort of double click on a couple of things that have been said by Gary and Justin. First, simplicity. I think, Justin, you said something about the need for this to be simple, but so did you, Gary, right? Policymakers want to respond, but you've got to make it easy so they understand that. So simplicity and clarity, I think, is really important. A second thing that I'll say is, just in terms of thinking about the role of social media, one of the parts of the social movements literature that I made reference to was the need for human capital. And what I mean by that is certain kinds of skills. So, figuring out people, maybe they're influencers, maybe they're bloggers, but certainly people who are paying attention to the issues and who can articulate those issues in a way that, as Justin, I think, really very eloquently said, localizes the issue and, meets people where they are at their dinner table, for example. That's another piece of this that I think is really important. And, one theme that we've all been referring to is emotional resonance. So how do we, we use the term visceral, but we can also think from the psychology literature of emotional resonance. How do we make that happen? And the truth is, it makes it seem like it's very difficult. But I think one of the things that Gary is articulating really well is that it's really actually not that difficult. It's empathy. It is understanding of the sort of human condition, which we all sort of know. It's common sense in some ways, and I don't think we need to overcomplicate that. We're all experiencing, for example, the effects of climate change in the West, with water in the West and in the East, everywhere. People know this, and it's just a matter of striking that chord and getting them to recognize this, that they're part of the solution. And it shouldn't really be that hard.
Thank you, Sarah. I appreciate that. This next question is for Justin. Part of what we're talking about here is elevating water in the consciousness of the public. What can those thinking about elevating water in people's minds learn from journalism's attempts to speak to diverse audiences on both sides of the aisle, especially around issues that may be contentious?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, I think there are lots of different ways that I approach a climate conversation, say on a panel like this, depending on who I'm speaking with, right? So, if I'm talking, I did a panel in September on climate where I was talking to Republicans on the Hill, and a lot of the conversation centered around some of the competitiveness issues that the US might be facing. And if I'm talking to a group of, progressive climate activists, I'm going to talk about some of the social justice concerns that are associated with climate change. So I think it's just about finding the right angle for the audience, and then when the audience are together, I mean, then you have to find common ground. And I think I don't know the ins and outs of the water issues as well, but certainly there are areas of common ground. And it's interesting, once you find there's areas of common ground, how much of the solution can come out of that might be at first seem totally ludicrous to both sides, but then you realize that things come together. And I mean, I would just offer one example, which is carbon capture, which is controversial, but it's something that you have senators, people on the Hill from Wyoming, West Virginia, conservative places and people sitting with some of the most progressive members of Congress working together, and then all of a sudden agreeing to this, like, basically price on carbon for captured carbon. This is something that would have seemed crazy until you figured out how to engage people from the get-go in a way that they could access the issue.
So Justin, thanks for that. We're talking about capturing carbon and how that is starting to get people engaged on both sides of the aisle and agreeing to move in a certain direction. So my question is for Gary. When have you seen companies that didn't do it well, where they haven't been able to get everybody who may be on different sides of an issue to come together and move forward with a collective action that benefits our world? Where have you seen where companies just didn't understand their customers, didn't understand how to present the issue, didn't understand how to engage legislators, where it was just disastrous, and we want to avoid that in the future?
Well, first of all, it's really easy. I can hold the mirror up and tell you all about mistakes because I've made plenty of them. And I want to actually pick up on Sarah and Justin by saying, the first and biggest mistake is not being what I call supply-sided and telling your story, but rather being demand-oriented and getting into the space of your audience. As Justin has said and as Sarah said, you're talking to legislators, know where they're at. Don't just come in with your own predisposed facts. I would say that the errors that I see with companies trying to make change. Well, let me also quickly first say something to what Sarah just said. Moving people to action. I mean, there's actually not that big a difference between lobbying and marketing, and for that matter, campaigning and branding, right? And moving people to action takes an emotional connection. It's not an intellectual one. You don't move to action because you like some facts. You move it because you read an article by Justin that touched you. You move it because you heard something visceral happen in your community. And the problem is that a lot of companies don't understand that. They try to be intellectual. They try to present an overwhelming number of facts. It just, again, causes us all to run and hide. So the errors that I have seen are quickly, number one, what I call high talk do ratios. Saying, not doing what you say, and saying things that aren't true. Don't exaggerate. Don't make promises you can't deliver. And conversely, be sure you do deliver on all promises. Because exaggeration is, you're dead. A journalist like Justin's gonna expose it, and that undermines all your credibility. Like I said, number two, don't lecture, don't talk down, don't be supply demanded. Speak from the point of view of how does this issue impact your end user? And number three, I said it before, but I'll say it again. Don't be so self-serious. Humor is a really powerful, humor and anecdote, I might add, humanizing as opposed to, proselytizing are so much more easy to hear and receive. And you might not agree, but, when you're self-deprecating and you lighten it up a little bit, again, I talked about this earlier, just one last quick comment. I mean, my goal with organic is not to say non-organic is bad. My goal with organic is choice, consumer choice. And if I go out there vilifying the others, now I can say the USDA symbol means that 700 chemicals are prohibited. That's a fact. I can't say I'm chemical free or chemicals hurt you. That's an exaggeration. And so that kind of fine line and humanity and humility are really important.
Thanks, Gary. Sarah, what about social movements to you that fizzled? What happened? Why? Same thing that Gary just cited, being a bit too dense, not being humorous, not attaching on a visceral level. What have you seen out there?
Those factors are all important, very, very important. And to social movement success and the sort of flip side of that being kind of failure or fizzling out. A few other things that I want to kind of call out here, which might also be related to some of these. So some movements fizzle out because they've succeeded. So they've got a single goal, they've been successful, and they disband. That's maybe that doesn't happen all of the time. Another thing that I think is important is some movements fizzle out because they've kind of run out of steam, or the people who are part of the movement have run out of steam, and they are sort of lacking commitment. And so successful movements know how to build and sustain the energy, especially in the face of adversity. And some of the things that Gary was just sharing, I think, are part of sustaining internal movement cohesion too. So humor, the power of humor and humility to keep people charged and ready to go and willing to mobilize is really important. I think also thinking about something that that Justin said, and I loved the imagery of the small building blocks building up to this larger narrative. We can think about that with respect to movements too. I like to think about it as thinking as in terms of small wins. So one of the things that social movements need to sustain themselves are some wins, especially in the face of adversity. So what kinds of smaller pieces or building blocks might a movement work on so that they can demonstrate some wins to keep people charged up and tell the story internally to their people too, with humor and with emotional appeal, so that the movements can continue. And then finally, I'll sort of say that, we see a lot of movements that fizzle out because of internal divisions. And so, for example, one of the things that happens with many movements is that they begin to have mission creep, for lack of a better term, but they begin to engage in other issues which perhaps they weren't engaged with at the beginning. And so they may begin to do that. And as they do kind of lose their focus, they also lose some of the power behind them. Some of the people who had been contributing to the social movement perhaps disagree with the way that the movement is going. They don't like the new issues that are being brought on. That's one possibility. But they also may disagree with some of the processes internally in the social movement. And of course, they can disagree with some of the people within the movement. We often think about social movement movements as some whole, but of course, for any of us who have been part of social movements know that it's part of the messiness of organizations and organizational life. We don't always get along with the people with whom we're working. And so successful social movements have figured out how to deal with all of these internal divisions. Again, whether it's on the mission or the goals of the organization, the issues, the processes, or just simple interpersonal dynamics within a social movement. And so if I were to sort of say, what should you do to prevent fizzling out as a movement, I would certainly say, think about the way in which you sustain commitment and are able to deal with internal conflicts, and how you can remain focused in your goals so that the people who have joined you remain committed to what those goals are.
Well, if I could quickly piggyback, because Justin put his finger on it before, bringing the next generation along, millennials, is critical. You want to have an impact on Capitol Hill, I mean, where letters and emails and phone calls still work, they still count. Show that the next gen of voters, the next class of voters is engaged in your issue. You want to show a supermarket buyer, that your product is going to sell. Show that the next batch of consumers, the new parents, are with your issue. It keeps your movement fresh, but it also shows breadth and depth, and it's very, very hard to for a senator or a congressperson, in the case of policy, to not read the tea leaves when they see a sizable number of younger people speaking up.
That's interesting. So Justin, since you talk about climate change and all those things, and we know that there are a lot of millennials very interested in climate change and have held legislators to task on it and talked about it on social media. How do you think that we can continue to get millennials interested in other type of movements such as water and get them interested in, from a journalist perspective, how we can get them reading about and interested in water and what we can do to conserve water and understand what the issues are surrounding water?
Yeah, well, I think I would say going back to some of the sort of meeting people at the dinner table, meeting them where they are. I would just say, what are millennials, what are Gen Z people talking about, right? Talking about climate change, talking about social justice issues, and I think finding ways to tie the water issue to the other things that young people are talking about is a pretty compelling way to go. I mean, I think it's interesting, the Sunrise Movement, which has been this hugely successful climate movement of climate activists. A lot of what they talk about, I went to one of their sit-ins, this would have been, I don't know, February of last year, and everyone went around and they talked about why they were engaged in climate and the Sunrise Movement. And a lot of it was talking about all sorts of social justice issues that were linked to climate, but very few of them said, well, I'm concerned about emissions. They talked about these other things. And so I think finding a way to talk about water conservation and water broadly in a way that intersects with all these other things that people are thinking about is really compelling.
On a related note, since we're talking about millennials and Zers and all of those folks, how do we get kids interested so that they have a lifelong interest in water and water conservation and all of those things? So that's to all of you. How do you think we can engage them?
And if I could just say, I have a specific comment on that, but just on piggybacking on Justin, and well, Sarah too, brings forward solutions as opposed to just talking about the problem. I found to be really important. If you just talk about the problem, you're just, Gary Downer, right? You're not. And again, it's just we have to recognize that our audience is getting avalanched with bad news, right? About every topic, particularly during a global pandemic. So I think it's very important to be positive and solution oriented. But per your question about Kids, I can tell you in my space, it's all about animals. You know, have a cow was not an accident. Kids might, I mean, they relate instantly to the cow and the calf and so on. And, you know, livestock and wildlife and water issues are pretty darn, you know, integrated here. When watersheds are in danger, the wildlife is in danger. And I think, you know, I want to be sympathetic to our audience that, you know, we've said on the one hand, there should be, you know, try to keep your focus, right? That there's a lot more strength and power and narrowing and targeting to that key message. I gave the example with organic, we're passionate about all things. But I also want to reconcile with Justin's point a second ago, which is, you know, if you're going to really tune into the audience, then you've got to figure out what all the different audiences want. I can tell you what kids don't want is a long iteration of facts and hopelessness. Animals, wildlife, reality. You know, we're in the business at Stonyfield right now of helping parks and schoolyards all over America, cities convert their parks and schoolyards to organic certification. There's 25 million kids who play every day on our parks and fields. And most of them are 70% of those fields are exposed to a cocktail of 3 herbicides. And so and the most powerful thing we can do is talk to the kids in those communities or the parents of those kids. By the way, pet walkers are also important, people who bring their pets out into these, because that's another way to pick up those herbicides. The point is, you know, talking about play, talking about enjoyment, talking about fun, not talking about, you know, the sky is falling and you're going to get cancer. That is terribly important. And by the way, you know, again, humor with kids is absolutely essential.
I'll sort of just piggyback on that. I was going to go to the same space as Gary did in terms of thinking about animals and wildlife and also humor. And, you know, in my experience, kids especially like it when adults are self-deprecating in their humor because they don't expect that from us. And so to the extent that we can do that can also, I think, help children to be part of this. And then the other thing that I wanted to come back to is something I said in my early remarks, and because I think it resonates not so much, yes, with the kids, but generally with what we're talking about. And that is the sort of way in which we can make sure that our message, our frame, answers the question of what's happening, why it's important, and then provides a call to action. So what? What do you want me to do now? And I think we've all said that in various ways, but the what, so what, now what kinds of questions I think are really important as we think about telling the story about why the issues exist around water in the West and water more generally. And then to Justin's point about knowing your audience too, and adjusting that basic message to children versus millennials versus older adults is really important.
So Sarah, I'm going to stay on you because you talked about elite allies in your introductory remarks. And so I wanted to find out a little bit more about that, and give some information to our audience about how you can recruit those elite allies, and what do you want them to do? You know, how, after you've recruited them, how do you get them focused and working with you to make sure that this issue is front and center in their minds, and then of course on the minds of others?
Yes, right. I think, so the first thing we need to sort of be clear about is when we're thinking about elite allies, we have to, you know, think about where these individuals exist. So are they part of the local government, the county government, the state government, the federal government? So figuring out where these people are, people who are sympathetic to whatever our issue might be. That's the first sort of task, is figuring out who they are. And as I mentioned, you know, one way to think about this is to use data. So how have people, if we're talking about the political system. How have they voted in the past on various bills or pieces of legislation? How have they spoken about various kinds of issues? So that's one piece of this. Now, when we think about elite allies in another realm, such as within for-profit firms, we can think about figuring out where they are similarly. What kinds of public statements have they made? Has a CEO or some C-suite person made about a commitment to the environment or a commitment to diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging? So that's another piece of this. Others from the research literature have even gone as far when measuring elite allies within corporations to look at political donations. So where are the sort of C-suite people within a different whatever organization, to whom are they donating and to what issues are they donating? So the first part of this, I think, is finding where these allies are. And then secondly, thinking about how you're going to capture their attention. And everything that we've been saying so far about telling story, about humor, about keeping it simple, about making the message as clear as possible is, pertains to this too. Because of course, there are many elite allies in the whole number of different institutions and organizations. And the key is trying to get their attention so that then you can enter into a dialogue. And as Gary said, begin to have some conversation about how those relationships can move forward either piece of legislation or a company policy or a new practice within a company that will be beneficial to whatever the issue is the movement is interested in. So it's both figuring out who they are and then capturing their hearts and minds as well, as we're trying to capture the hearts and minds of other people, other individuals who may become part of our campaign. It's also capturing their hearts and minds too, so that you can use the relationship to the advantage of the movement.
Thank you, Sarah. Justin, I'm going to ask you a question. And how do you make the climate story stand out when there are so many other news stories, particularly in this season, that always seem to command more attention? Often for an understandable reason, but what can people who cover water do to make their story stand out, particularly when there's just a lot to cover in the world?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think it certainly is a challenge, right? But I think what it is it goes back to sort of what I was saying earlier, which is connecting things with what people are talking about. I think particularly this year that this has been a theme for me, whether it's the story I mentioned about reopening schools, but it's also talking about what the COVID crisis will mean for climate, and just linking that directly. Yeah, I mean, I guess it's sort of straightforward. I'll leave that there. Actually, I'll just say one thing about just to Sarah's point, which I thought was very interesting, and just thinking about elite allies and the degree to which people who are influencers, who are shapers of the news, are actually just consumers of news in many of the ways that everyday people are. I just had a conversation a few days ago for a story I wrote this week about candidates needing to be convinced to talk about climate change, because maybe they understood the science, but they just were sort of skeptical, and the sort of campaign that needed to happen within campaigns to say, hey, look at the data. This is actually, you need to be convinced, and a big part of that is seeing like the activism and the movements that are happening outside. And so I just wanted to add that one point.
Can I add a quick comment on elites? We've had various experiences using celebrity to help. It's very effective, right? People see somebody who Adam Scott from Parks and Rec, happens to have kids who play on his local parks every day, and so he jumped aboard our campaign to convert fields to organic methods, and he was great. He was funny and all of that. And it works as an attention grabber, but I would caution against over-dependence on celebrity at the same time, because everybody is there's a bit of cynicism out there that anybody can pay anybody to say anything. And so it's a question of how authentic, right, are they? And the fact that he's actually a soccer coach on the side and he could be there with his kids. Byron DeChambeau, the guy who just won, I think that's his name, sorry. He just won the US Open golf. Turns out he was pounding 7 Orgain shakes a day to bulk up, protein shakes. I'm on the board of Orgain. You know, we signed him on to a sponsorship by literally just giving him product. I mean, today we couldn't afford him, right? Because he's now like #1 golfer in America. But he could talk authentically about what actually happened, and you could see it in his body, and you know, longer drives. I mean, that was just an amazing piece of luck. So, which leads me to Justin's last point. As I said earlier, we use bloggers and influencers to great effect. Not just because some of them have 18 to 20 million followers, like I said, but because they're real. They're moms, they're cooks, they're people who are like regular folks who maybe left their day job to do this thing because they're passionate about it. And boy, for people advocating on water issues, having folks in the community who are either dealing with water quantity, water reductions, water quality, who look like and are like the folks that they're trying to talk to, that is really an important, to me, that's the most elite and long-term effective kind of influencer to bring to the table.
Thanks, Gary. Sarah, it looks like you want to say something.
I do, because I wanted to come back. Yeah. I wanted to come back to 2 other themes that we've been talking about, and I want to call them out as really important to the study of social movements and what we've been talking about. And the first is authenticity. I think either Gary or Justin used that term, and I think that's really at the heart of what Gary was just talking about in terms of thinking about influencers who look like, sound like, who that the people you're trying to influence can directly identify with. Really important in terms of social movements too, authenticity. And the kind of, I guess, almost potentially a flip side of that is hypocrisy. That is, I think we've all been saying this, but I want to call it out and, you know, sort of put a pin in it, that when we think about social movements or businesses, or presumably journalists who are behaving in hypocritical ways, it's a surefire way to have a campaign blow up. And so we've got to be incredibly attuned to making sure that whoever our spokespeople are for a movement or a company are not behaving in a hypocritical way. And there's so many examples of how hypocrisy has blown up, not just in businesses, not just in social movements, but certainly in politics and other realms as well. So while 2 obvious points, I want to make sure we put a pin in authenticity and also in this sort of idea of hypocrisy.
Justin, my final question, and then I'll let everybody say a few words. But I wanted to find out from you, because I'm sure we have some PR people here who are in our audience, and want to find out how best to pitch water stories to journalists. What is the angle that they need to start getting that narrative out there and start planting those seeds? How to best connect with you, how to best work with journalists to get their stories out about water?
Yeah, it's a good question. And I think I would say to think about some of the points that I made earlier. So, you know, if a PR person pitching does half the work, you know, for me and is already thought about, you know, what is the either way to localize it? What is the community that I can tell this story around, the character I can tell this story around? What is the connection to the news that I might be able to use? I mean, if they've done that work, that's half the battle. I would say, you know, just to be frank, oftentimes you get some, you know, sort of frankly ludicrous connections, like, you know, that sometimes PR people try to draw. And so I would say avoid that, because then I will probably just, you know, for lack of a better word, just, you know, well, just not pay much attention to it. So, but authentically try to do some of that groundwork that I was talking about. And I think, you know, the other thing, just sort of to my final point in my opening remarks, is sort of setting expectations, understanding that perhaps setting up a call with me might feed the story down the line. I may not write about, the exact report or thing that you're calling me about, but it is good to connect and perhaps set the expectations low, and then something will come out of it down the line. And I think oftentimes I'll get pitches and I'll just say, well, I don't have time to write this. But if the PR person says, this doesn't have to be a story, but thought you should connect, I'm much more likely to do that call, because the worst thing for me is when I, do a call and then I get 30 follow-up emails. Where's the story? So just, be open to connecting, having a conversation, and hopefully something will come from it down the line.
Thank you, Justin. Okay, we have about 10 minutes, and I wanted to give every panelist an opportunity for last thoughts, last words on storytelling before we wrap up. I want to thank you all for being panelists. This has been a wonderful conversation, a lot of things to learn about social movements and how we are able to position ourselves within water to tell the stories that we need to tell to make changes in people's hearts and minds. So, final thoughts, Sarah.
Thank you, Yolanda. And once again, I want to thank the organizers of the panel. I want to thank my fellow panelists and, of course, Yolanda for making this so much fun. I feel like I've learned a lot. I'll come back to just a couple of points that I hope will be useful for the audience. And the first of these is to, think about frame and emotional resonance, keep it emotional. Think about frames and frame clarity. Keep it simple, keep it clear. And then always think about, portraying what the future will be like if we are successful at this. That serves as a wonderful call to action, and that will bring people to the table. And then, I'll sort of say finally, I loved Gary's points about humor. And I think, not forgetting that even though the issues related to water, issues related to water in the West may not seem like they are funny, because they're not, thinking about ways to tell the story in a way that will appeal to people who will like humor, because we do like humor. It's a surefire way to bring us to the table. So with that, thank you again to everybody, and thanks for having me be part of the panel.
Thanks, Sarah. Gary, any final words?
Well, again, I want to be empathetic to the audience here because, look, I'm all for coalition and bridge building. I think it's a lot easier to reach across the divide, or to be successful by reaching across the divide than not. But there are issues that people in this audience are working on that there isn't a common ground, okay? And I think it's okay to acknowledge that. On climate, we need to price carbon. We need to put a premium on carbon sequestration. In my state, we're having a big battle about net metering. It's not like a gray area. You either have it or you don't. In my areas of organic, we need labeling of GMOs. You either have them or you don't. So I don't want to feign naivete or be Pollyannish that, on water issues, there are some absolute theirs you got to be at, and you got to fight like heck and give no ground, and that's legitimate. And whether it's quotas, protections, water, implementing in suburbs, water restrictions to whatever the solution is. And I might say, contamination, making sure that our waters are clean, which again is a big part of organic. So what I want to say to that point is, please don't misconstrue anything that I'll speak for my panelists that any of us have said, but certainly that I have said, to suggest that there aren't times where you have to, take no prisoners. And I hope that the hints like the ones that Sarah just summarized can be helpful to you. I would simply say, it is absolute, if you study really effective lobbying, policy change, you realize there's just some basic rules. One is numbers count. And so to get your numbers, you got to do the things we've talked about. You've got to be emotional. Because again, you're not just talking about moving people with facts. You've got to move them to actually act, to pick up the phone, to travel to the Capitol or Washington. But also having your act together, having as broad a constituency as possible. There may be a 30-40% out there you're never going to get. But go in, not exaggerating, not overstating, not overpromising, be solutions oriented, but be direct, be clear, and be human. Because in the end, these folks, that audience is up, they're always thinking about re-election, right? So they want numbers. And, hopefully these hints will help you. Again, not to suggest there's compromise possible everywhere, because a lot of times there isn't.
Thank you, Gary. Justin?
Yeah, well, thank you for having me again, and it's great to be on a panel with both Sarah and Gary. I actually learned quite a bit, and that's I'm so glad to be here. I think I would just close by reiterating my sort of end remark from my opening remarks, which is thinking about the arc of building a narrative and the building blocks. And I would just say, to think about the climate movement, which has had some ups and downs in a sort of upward trajectory of engagement. And just to think, from the time I started doing this beat 6 years ago to where we are now, things have really changed dramatically. And there was a laying of groundwork and a sort of slow upward trajectory. And then all of a sudden things changed. And there's a lot of reasons for that. I would, make an argument about a bunch of different factors that coalesced, but they did coalesce. And all of a sudden the conversation, the narrative took off into overdrive. And so, I would just say, if you're concerned about the water story not really resonating in a big enough way, I mean, obviously some movements fizzle, and I don't want to, be presumed that the water narrative will explode the same way climate has. But just continue to think about the fact that you're building these blocks, and that perhaps one day, I don't know what it is, those things will coalesce to really drive a change in the way people understand this broadly. Thank you again.
So thank you, everyone. Sarah, Gary, Justin, you all have been wonderful. I've learned a lot. I'm sure people in our audience have learned a lot. And I do hope that everyone in the audience has tools that they can now use as they go forth in their work in water and change minds, change hearts, and as Gary said, get people to action. Understand those frameworks that Sarah talked about, how to actually pitch to people, how to use those building blocks to get those narratives out there and continuously and consistently, and how we can be clear, be human, be concise, and get those numbers. So I am very thankful to all of you for being here. Thank you to the organizers. I want to now hand over things to the president of CSU Global, Pamela Toney. Thank you again.